Welcome to the Environmental Justice Lab. I'm your host, Dr. Leslie Joseph. Thank you so much for joining me. So before I even get started, I want to just thank everybody for your patience. I took about a month off from the podcast. There was a lot going on, a lot of things that were changing in my home, at my job. And so I'm glad that you hung in there with me, stuck it out until I could get back on the microphone. Thank you so much. I'll just let you know right away. I got a new job at the University of South Carolina. I'm on the faculty there in the Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering. So that was very exciting. My wife, she plays tennis and she plays it at a very high level. And so she was inducted into her college Hall of Fame this past weekend. So we went to that. School's starting, everything's going on, but I'm glad that I'm back and I'm glad that you're back listening. Thank you so much for the support. I really, really, really appreciate it. And with that being said, we are back and we are still talking about prisons and specifically prisoners, people who are incarcerated. So if you remember on the last episode, I was just trying to bring some humanity to the conversation around prisoners, about prisons. And all I wanted to say last time we met was this, that prisoners are people. That's all I wanted you to know, that they are people. They have parents just like you do. They may have siblings. They have family members all over the place. They're in their communities. They have hopes. They have dreams. They have aspirations. They want to be certain things when they grow up. They didn't have any desires to be in prison. They are people just like us. And so I wanted to make sure that was highlighted in the last episode, because before we start talking about the issues, we have to remember we're talking about people who are dealing with these issues, real life people. And it is so important to keep that in mind whenever we have these discussions. And so let's remember that. We can talk about the issues, we can talk about justice, we can talk about the environment, but we have to recognize that we are talking about people ultimately. And so with that understanding, let's now talk about prisons. Because in this episode, I want to talk specifically about where these prisons are built, where they're located, right? These toxic sites, these hazardous waste sites, these locations where a lot of prisons are built are already setting people up to be in extremely harmful living conditions. I'm talking about prisons that are built on top of landfills, built at Superfund sites, built at abandoned hazardous waste facilities, built in places where you wouldn't want to put anything else. You wouldn't want to put even a farm there with animals. But we have prisons built in these locations. And we need to talk about the impact that having these prisons at these locations has on the people living inside the prison, because they have no say in the matter. They don't get to choose where they live once they're incarcerated. They are just placed in a prison that was probably built in a location where nothing should be built because it's so dangerous and so hazardous. And so that's what we're talking about in this episode. We're digging right into the reality that prisons are very often built in places where things should not be built, especially if you're going to have people living there. So let's do that on this episode of the Environmental Justice Lab. Stay tuned. Welcome to the Environmental Justice Lab. I'm your host, Dr. Joseph. Thank you so much for listening. So we are talking about prisons and where they're located. It is a very, very, very important issue that we need to discuss, especially from an environmental justice perspective, because where you're located means a whole lot in terms of your living conditions, your standard of living, the exposures that you have, and the health outcomes and quality of life that you get to enjoy wherever you are. So where you're placed really, really matters. And when it comes to prisons, they're not put in the nicest of places. Let's just be honest about that. Let's just get the facts on the table just so we are all talking the same language. So about 1/3 of state And federal prisons are located within 3 miles of federal Superfund sites. Now, if you don't know what a Superfund site is, a Superfund site is one of the most seriously contaminated places that you can find in the United States of America. We'll talk about it a little bit later in the episode, but basically a Superfund site is so contaminated and so hazardous that the federal government comes in to deal with the cleanup. That's how bad it is. And about a third of these prisons are within 3 miles of these sites. Right? According to a GIS analysis in 2010, about 589 federal and state prisons are located within 3 miles of a Superfund site, and 134 of those are within 1 mile. So right next to these sites, these Superfund, super hazardous places in our country are neighbors to these prisons, which causes extreme harm and extreme damage to the residents in those facilities. So here's some examples of what we're talking about, what we're thinking about. So I got these examples from the Prison Policy Initiative. I'll put a link in the description. You can read through them yourself as well. These are just some of the many examples of the kinds of locations that these prisons are placed nearby and what it does to the people that are in those prisons. So, in Pennsylvania, there's a prison located on top of a coal ash dump. And because it's located there, the people who live in that prison, who are housed there, they have skin rashes, sores, stomach issues. There's been instances of cancer, and the data has shown that some of these symptoms come right after you get onto this prison, right when you get into this prison, because the effects of that coal ash dump that you're sitting on top of is immediate once you enter into the prison. And so if you're living there 24/7 every day for your term, for your sentence, whatever you're serving, you're exposed to all the toxic contaminants that are coming from this coal waste dump that's right beneath you. That's in Pennsylvania. And so another example, in Appalachia, they're building new prisons there left and right to try to address the failed economics that they're seeing because of the waning coal industry that's there. So if you can imagine, you're destroying mountaintops to extract coal, you're doing tons of mining, you're damaging the environment. But now that coal seems to be on its way out because of how damaging and toxic it is and how it's fueling climate change, and people are trying to move away from it, prisons are being built as a way to drive economic development. More jobs, more opportunities, all these things are happening in these areas. So in Kentucky, for instance, they've seen this exodus of people from the coal industry. They're trying to build prisons there. And now the prisoners that are in these facilities are reporting high rates of cancer. They're being told not to drink or shower with the water. There's daily health advisories and hazards that they're trying to mitigate each and every day with what's happening in the prisons themselves. And so the idea of getting a job at this prison is resulting in increased health and related economic issues for the area, because when you work in a place that is so toxic and so damaging to your health, the economics don't make sense anymore. There's no reason to do that. And the whole legacy of the environmental degradation and contamination that exists in these coal-rich areas that have been mined and mined for decades and decades is starting to show itself as other industries are trying to come in. And so when we see prisons come, we see the health impacts, we see the issues that come along with that, and it's just a big problem. It's a big problem. And so that is one way that people are trying to use prisons. They're trying to move them into places where you wouldn't put anything else because it's not clean, it's not safe. And so prisoners are being forced to deal with the fallout and the impact from a legacy of environmental contamination and degradation. That's what's happening there. In New York City, for instance, the Rikers jail complex is right on top of a landfill. They just built it right on top of one. And so because of that, you have toxic fumes coming out from the landfill, entering into the prison, into the jail complex. You have trash that's being decomposed. And when you have a landfill, we're getting into some technical stuff now, but you have a landfill, you have trash, you have organic matter that's decomposing, that is being converted from matter, from solids to liquids to gases as it's being consumed. With the activity happening in the landfill, those toxic fumes, that toxic leachate, that liquid coming out from the bottom under it, all of those things are contaminating the environment around this jail complex. And it got so bad that the correctional officers inside the jail sued the city, sued for damages because of what they experienced living. Well, not for them. They were just working at that jail complex. Imagine the prisoners that live there, that are housed there. How awful would it be for them to continually be exposed to all of that contamination? That's what's happening there in New York City at this particular jail complex. In Louisiana, there's a prison right next to an abandoned tire landfill, and that landfill caught on fire because it's rubber, it's abandoned, nobody's managing it. Caught on fire, it burned for 4 days before they did anything about it, before they evacuated the prison and tried to deal with the issues. And so all the health impacts of being next to a tire landfill that is burning rubber, air being contaminated all around you for 4 days straight, breathing that in, having to deal with that causes significant health issues, significant mental anguish, and it took 4 days before anything happened. I promise you, if it was some other place around the country, 4 minutes, and they would have done something about the issue of a burning tire landfill next to homes or next to businesses or next to schools. They wouldn't have waited so long to do something. But because it's a prison, because we don't care so much for the people that are in the prison, they let that fire burn for days before anything happened. Days. That's what happened at that particular location. And I promise you, there are thousands of stories just like this. Stories of prisons being built next to abandoned storage tank farms and prisons being built on top of various types of landfills, hazardous waste landfills, regular landfills, all kinds of ways of using land that we know is uninhabitable and putting a prison in its proximity. Nobody's going to build anything else there, so you put a prison instead, and you put prisoners in those locations to deal with the fallout from the contamination that those sites have wrought all across the environment. And they're there left to deal with it with no resources, no advocacy. They don't have a lobbying group. They don't have any financial backing to support any kind of action on their behalf. They can't do anything to confront these problems. Nothing at all. I mean, think about what it means to have a prison that's built in these toxic waste areas across the country. It means that people are constantly breathing in toxic air day in, day out, in the evenings, when they wake up, when they go outside. It means that people are drinking contaminated water. All those contaminants are getting into the groundwater, getting into the water system, and they're being forced to drink it because they have no recourse. It means that people who are living in these conditions are dealing with higher levels of physical and mental illness. Both of those things are happening. And the research is very clear on this. If you live near these toxic sites, these Superfund sites, these abandoned areas, you're at a greater risk to get different types of cancers. You're at a greater risk to have respiratory illness like asthma or emphysema. Even your life expectancy is lowered by living in these areas. The research is out there. It is very clear. It is more than problematic. It is hazardous, it is dangerous, it's even deadly to live in these areas. And yet we're putting prisons housing thousands of people next to these facilities, next to these areas, on top of these abandoned hazardous waste sites. And, for me, the most frustrating part about it is that when it comes to putting these prisons in these locations, this is what the government's doing. This isn't some private industry trying to save some money or some private corporation trying to do what's the best for their bottom line or for their own interest. This is the government doing this. So state governments, federal governments, they're the ones who decide where to put the federal prisons and the state prisons. Corporations are trying to save money. Obviously, they're trying to do different things. They don't have as much of an investment in the people that are housed in these prisons, but the government should. The government is responsible for protecting its citizens, for caring for those under their jurisdiction, whether they're incarcerated or not. They committed a crime, fine. You've put them through due process and they've been found guilty, fine. You decide to put them in jail and prison for what they committed, fine. It doesn't mean that they should be living in these kinds of conditions. It doesn't mean that you get to just put them right next to places where nobody would want to live. It doesn't give you the right to do that. And so there's no reason for people who are in prison, who are incarcerated, to have to live in these conditions. They're already in prison. They're already restricted. They're already being punished for what they've done to violate their rights to clean air, to clean water, basic human rights that the United Nations recognizes. It's something that we can't allow. It can't be done, not in a developed country, not anywhere. These are the kinds of things that shouldn't be even existing in our society. Not at all. And you know what? It doesn't have to be this way. This is not the way it has to be. We're not, just having to just accept the reality that certain types of people are going to have to live in certain areas, and that's just the way it is. And these people who are in prison shouldn't have done what they've done, or they wouldn't be living here. That's not how that works. Because we have ways to clean up these toxic waste sites, to clean up these hazardous areas. And it all started in 1980 when Congress passed the Comprehensive Environmental Response Compensation and Liability Act, which most people call CERCLA, specifically to deal with these hazardous waste areas. So the word Superfund comes from that act where a site that's been deemed to be so hazardous that you need a federal government intervention is called a Superfund site, and it gets money from CERCLA, this act, to clean it up. So the act gives money to the government to clean up these sites, and it forces the people who are responsible for the contamination to either clean it up or to reimburse the government when they clean it up. That's what this act does. And so we have a mechanism in place. So if you ever actually want to build next to a Superfund site, fine, clean it up first. You can clean up this site before you build next to it. There is a bill in place that's been signed into law for decades on the books. There's a mechanism in place to fund it. All you have to do is get the EPA, get your local government to find out who's responsible, and make them clean up what they did. Clean up your mess because we're trying to build around here, right? Because according to the EPA, the goal of CERCLA, of this act, of all this stuff is fourfold. They want to protect human health and the environment by cleaning up these sites. Good, that's one. They want to make responsible parties pay for the cleanup. That's two. That makes sense because if you make them pay, maybe they'll stop contaminating so much. That's the idea. Third is to involve the communities in the process of cleaning it up. That way the people who live nearby or who are in the vicinity understand what's happening, how it's being cleaned up, and what the future plans are for the area. And then the fourth thing is to return the sites to a productive use, right? So the idea was never to just abandon a certain area because it's so contaminated we want to leave it. The idea was to clean it up and allow it to be used in a productive way. So then, if you want to put your state prison, your federal facility next to a Superfund site, you can, because you've cleaned it up, you've involved everybody into that process, and now we can do something productive with the land, with the area, instead of leaving it the way it is, allowing it to continue to contaminate the environment, and then putting people next to it who then have to deal with the fallout from that contamination. That is not the way it's supposed to go. And this is something that should not be happening, right? I mean, why are we even building prisons at these sites? Why are we putting prisons next to Superfund locations that have not been returned to their productive uses? Why are we doing that? And why are prisoners so disproportionately impacted by the presence of these toxic sites? Why? I don't hear anybody else talking about living near a Superfund site. It's prisoners, it's Black and brown communities, it's indigenous. I mean, obviously we know the answer. The answer is it's an environmental justice issue. That's the answer. That's the problem that we have to deal with and confront. And with prisoners, like I said on the first episode of the series, they are our nation's forgotten environmental justice community. Nobody thinks about them. Nobody cares about them. Nobody considers their well-being and their health and their standard of living when decisions are made about where they're going to be located. We've completely forgotten about them. We've completely neglected to consider their humanity in our decision making. And until that changes, we're going to continue to see more of this kind of prison siting, the same kind of conditions, the same issues over and over and over again. It's not going to change. And so let me just end this episode by just reminding you of a few things. 1, a third, over 580 federal and state prisons are located in some of the most toxic areas in the United States. And I'm just talking about the United States. I don't even know what happens around the world, but I imagine the same phenomena exists elsewhere around the globe. That prisons are placed in places where nobody else would live, where the people who are there are being disproportionately impacted and coming down with various diseases and illnesses as a result of just the location of those prisons, of those facilities. I'm sure it is happening everywhere else. If it's happening in America, where we claim to have this high view of human rights and we have the resources and we have the mechanisms to actually get things done and cleaned up and prepared for productive uses of land, and we still have this problem, I'm sure it's happening in a lot of other places all over the world. Another thing to remember is that putting prisons in these areas leaves the prisoners vulnerable to a wide range of diseases, of illnesses, of problems, physical problems, mental problems, illnesses that they need help to address. And of course, it's not just the exposure itself that is responsible. It's a big part and it's awful, but also the lack of health care that's available to them while they're in prison is another issue. It's also another episode we should talk about because the access to medical and mental health services in prisons, it's awful. It is by far one of the worst situations to be in. And because you're in prison, you're already susceptible to all of these illnesses just by virtue of being confined for a long period of time. And yet, the access is not there. It's a problem, right? So you put prisons in the most toxic areas in the United States. You have prisoners being exposed to all these different types of contamination. They're getting diseases and illnesses that are preventable. They don't have the health care for it. And we're doing all that when we have a mechanism in place to clean these areas up. We should be doing that. We should be advocating for these Superfund areas to be returned to a productive use, like the EPA says it wants to do, before anything gets built there, not just prisons, just anything, a neighborhood, a community. If there's one person, one house next to a Superfund site, that's a problem. Clean up the site. Make sure that it's inhabitable for people. Do that first before you put anything anywhere near it. That's what I would say. And so I'm going to end this episode with these questions because I want you to check your heart. I want you to check your view of prisons and prisoners and the incarcerated populations, wherever you are. Ask yourself, how do I really feel about people in prison? Right? People in jail. People in detention centers. How do I feel about the conditions that they live under? Would I want anyone that I know to live in those conditions? I know I wouldn't. There's no reason for anyone to live like this. I said 1/3. It could be 1 out of 300. It's still too many. It's still too many. And we shouldn't allow, or to say another way, we shouldn't expect that this is how it's going to be. We don't have to accept this reality that we currently see in front of us when it comes to the ways in which prisoners are housed and where their locations are placed with respect to hazardous facilities. We don't have to accept that. I would encourage everybody to get involved in some way to raise awareness and to push back against this whole system that places prisoners in these hazardous conditions. Right? I just attended a conference and I heard a series of presentations about this very issue, this very exact thing. It was called, what was it called? It was called Environmental Racism, Incarceration, and America's Toxic Prisons. And the idea was that this whole prison industry continues to push and press injustices onto those who are incarcerated. And it was great to hear the presentation because I already had that thought back when I first started the series in August. It's just good to see that there's movement and that there's energy and there are advocates pushing for things to be different. I would encourage you to listen to that presentation, those presentations. I put a link in the description, and get involved. Do something, whatever it is, to continue to push against this reality that this is where prisons are being placed. This is how prisoners are being treated, because it shouldn't happen. It shouldn't happen in America. It shouldn't happen anywhere else in the world, because prisoners are people just like us. They deserve their full measure of human rights and human dignity and respect. And we should continue to push for ways to treat them as such, no matter where they are and no matter what they've done to be placed where they are. We should all be treated with dignity and respect. And that's our episode. Thank you so much for listening to the Environmental Justice Lab, where we are for the people and for the planet. See you next time.